As you all know, now, at this time in Paris, we are having this conference on climate change. 150 nations are there. And they want to talk about how can we save this planet. And our center also has taken up this project. Protecting the environment has increasingly become a matter of interfaith partnerships. Hindu, Christian, Muslim, Baha'is, Jewish, and other faith leaders have developed declaration about the urgency of climate change. The Parliament of the world's religion made climate change one of the 4 main themes for the nearly 10,000 people who gathered from around the world in October 2015. The research question for this study: how do various Edmontonians of diverse religious backgrounds see climate change, and how do their understanding of their faith and science combine on this issue? Professor Randy Haluza-Delay from the King's University of Alberta, and who is one of our board member of the Interfaith Centre, has taken up this cause, creating awareness of disastrous climate change through his research, writing, and teaching. We are glad that he is going to share his work with us this evening. He has prepared this report with one of his students, Ashley Fischer. Both of them are going to present this report tonight. It is my pleasure to invite him to the podium now with Ashley. Ladies and gentlemen.
Hello. Ashley's gonna sit over there right now because we don't have a remote mouse, so she'll be pushing the buttons here. So this is a research project that we're very glad that the Edmonton Interfaith Centre helped to kind of facilitate it happening. And it has actually been a research project that's about 6 years in the making, and Ashley's going to talk a little bit more about its origins. Basically, this is the flow that we're going to go with. We want to talk briefly about the problem of climate change, although we will not go into that very much. And then talk a little bit about religions and climate change. And then this report in particular and what Edmontonians think in a couple of different areas. And then the role of religions in addressing climate change and the environment in general. And I think it's really important to recognize that all of our faith communities have a role. And hopefully you'll get something out of this that you can take back to your faith communities. You could also ask Ashley to come and talk to your community too. She's very willing to do that, and you'll see that she'll do a great job. So, lots of research, lots of information, and not just the global average temperature increase, but lots of other lines of evidence are pointing to something major is happening with our planet. Global environmental change, climate change, is that thing. But that's not the only thing, because we also have massively decreasing biodiversity and ecosystems declining all over the planet. Those factors aren't part of climate change per se. So we have a major environmental kind of catastrophe looming. And again, as that thing in the middle says, 24 major indicators, 24 categories, 25,000 indicators. There's a lot of information that's saying things are going bad. Now that's bad news, but we as religious people have hope and faith. So it's important to pay attention to that as well. And mostly we can have hope and faith because when we have the information, we can also do something about it. One of the issues with climate change is that it will increase the vulnerability and exposure of folks around the world. All communities, all societies will not face the changes to the climate in the same way, and those that are weaker or less resilient, those with fewer resources, will be at an increased risk. So that's what we talk about when we mention the term climate justice, that not everybody faces things in the same way. And religious groups have paid attention to climate justice, and it's been one of the organizing frames that they've used to talk about why we need to do something. So in Canada, we have the resources to adapt to whatever happens. We're wealthy. We're the global elites. We're in the top 5% of the world. We also have a responsibility then to do something with our elite status. But not everybody in Canada is the same either. There are marginalized peoples in Canada, poor communities, northern communities, Aboriginal reserves. Different kinds of people will also face different effects of climate change. So climate justice extends across the globe, but it also extends within nations and communities themselves. Go ahead, Ashley. So what can religions do? Well, let's recognize that some 65 to 80% of the world's population affiliates with one or another of the world's major religions and many indigenous or folk religions. So this is just a chart put out by the Pew Center about the relative distribution. And some of this is referenced in the report. So what I did was, at each of your tables, there's a 2-page summary of things. And the only thing that's lacking is the recommendations at the very end. I was trying to fit 2 pages. But there's also a larger, it's a 35-page report, and one of the appendices has resources by faith tradition on the issue of climate change. So you can take it back to your communities. That will also be posted on the Edmonton Interfaith Centre website as a PDF that you can just download and have for yourself, or print off if you want it. So religions are addressing climate change in a number of different ways. I'll just highlight a couple of them. First of all, humanitarian and aid organizations like Islamic Relief, like World Vision, like Caritas, and many others are paying attention and knowing that climate change will affect the development work and the aid work that they do. As it increases the number of disasters through extreme weather events, there will be more and more pressure for humanitarian organizations. And so they're already gearing up and paying attention to how that will affect resources. Secondly, there's some mobilization, but very, very little, and it's very, very spotty. What's happening on the ground, like in the pews, so to say, in the Christian tradition, in mosques, temples, synagogues, and so forth? What is happening is unknown. Faith leaders are making statements, but how that's trickling down is very unclear. As a researcher, we just don't have the information on that. But, like I said, faith leaders are making declarations and statements, and there's been a whole whack of them coming out recently. Pope Francis' encyclical. Before that, 300 and now 425 Jewish rabbis in the United States put out a statement about climate change. In August, the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change came out of Turkey. On October 30th, the Buddhist leaders statement on climate change, and it just keeps on going. Back in 2011, the Canadian Interfaith Call for Action and Leadership on Climate Change was delivered with signatories from most of the major religious traditions in Canada. And just in September, the Canadian Council of Churches also put out a statement called Promoting Climate Justice and Ending Poverty in Canada. Faith communities in Canada speak out. And I also had Buddhist and Sikh signatories as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, and she's going to talk about this particular project, what we did with Edmontonians.
So as Randy was saying, my name is Ashley, and I am from the King's University. I'm currently in my 4th year, so just geared up to the end. But for this specific report, I'm just going to start with background. For this, in 2009, King's partnered with the University of Calgary, and when they did that, they decided to do a conference on the moral implications of climate change. And through that, there was a participant that was really excited and decided to get some dialogue going. So she started getting together some well, discussions basically. She set up meetings for climate change and interfaith and climate change meetings. So through that, it seemed quite promising, but it started to dwindle. However, there was like about 20-ish people that did start attending this. And it did provide a pool of people that are interested in climate change and in a faith-based context. So fast forward to a few years later, in the winter of 2014, I took a class with Randy, and it was Sociology of Science and Society at the King's University. And we decided as a class that we were going to do a research project, because there was only about 9 of us in the class, on climate change and interfaith beliefs. So in that, we conducted 14 interviews. Many of these were from the climate change and interfaith meetings that lady set up. And so you can kind of see from here sort of the breakdown of the interviews that we did. And from this, in the interviews, we did semi-structured conversational kind of format to allow for conversations between the participants and the student researchers that were doing this. And it also allows for a deep contextual understanding of the person's faith, which is pretty important in this kind of research that we're doing. So we did a thematic analysis. So we kind of gathered themes in the data of the interview so that we could sort of understand what Edmontonians of different faiths are thinking. So the research question that we decided as a class to talk about was, how do various Edmontonians of diverse religious backgrounds see climate change, and how do their understandings of their faith and science combine on this issue? So what do Edmontonians think? There were 3 major categories that we kind of compiled. So we'll discuss these different areas that participants talked about. So there's faith in science, perceptions about the environment, and then roles of religions for protecting the environment. For faith in science, one interesting aspect out of this is that what we could see from all of the interviews that we collected is all participants didn't believe that science and religion were in conflict. The reason why this is so interesting is because it is a standard belief that they are in conflict, and especially in the media, it seems to sort of be portrayed that they can be in conflict, whereas we didn't see that in any of the participants that came. Instead, what we saw was either faith in science as complementary, faith in science as segregated, or intertwined. For faith in science as complementary, this sort of means that the two can fit together, kind of like puzzle pieces, but they do not overlap. So they can sort of help each other out and understand certain aspects, but they're just kind of together and they can relate to each other, but they're not overlapping. So an example of this is from one of the interviews that we did. A Christian Pentecostal male said that, "I see science as a way to help us understand aspects of the creation, and so I see science as complementary to faith, not antagonistic to faith. And I don't get caught up in trying to make a book like the Bible a scientific book." So for this, you can kind of see that science isn't antagonistic to faith. The book like the Bible is not supposed to be a scientific book. It's supposed to be a book on faith and on a religious belief. So in this sense, they complement each other, and science can help to see aspects of creation which can help in faith, but they're not overlapping. For faith in science is segregated, this is the idea that these spheres aren't really related to each other. They're both really important, but they are quite separate from each other. So like the puzzle pieces that you can see there, they're not touching. An example of this from the data that we collected is that science and religion are the 2 arms of a body. So where the science helps me to understand the process of what is happening, the religion helps me spiritually to understand that it is my duty to do it, and I have got to make that personal contribution. So from this, he first talks about two arms of a body, so one being on different sides, and where science helps to understand the process of what's happening, and religion helps me to understand what to do, but he's not really putting them together at all. So you can just see how there are two different spheres here. For science and religion as intertwined, this is the idea that they're interconnected or intertwined. So people are putting them together in different ways. For this first participant, this Christian Reformed male, this man used a hymn that presented a metaphor of a stream. So he said that sometimes they move past each other, they mix, they reinforce each other, they carry you away sometimes they contradict each other, but ultimately they are two currents in the same stream and mixing together and complementing each other. So from this you can see the idea that science and religion together are fluid, they're dynamic, and instead of them being separate, they are in a river. So both of them, they're always together. They can be contradicting each other, complementing each other, and that kind of thing. And even though he uses the language of complementing, these are very different in the sense that they're overlapping in many ways. For this next gentleman, he talks about, so this is what he says, you as an individual aren't forced to take the teachings. You do not have to accept them until you've really analyzed and rationalized your way through them. At that point, you will become enlightened and there will be no question. So what's interesting here is that he's using some sort of like scientific explanation in a sense to talk about his faith. So he's analyzing it, he's rationalizing it, and you become enlightened. So he's really sort of merging the two fields together in a way that they're being intertwined. For perceptions of the environment, all seem to agree that the environment is damaged, and all participants also agreed or had a desire to connect their faith and their environment to each other. For this, just a side note, climate change was kind of blended into the beliefs about the environment. So when we were talking to participants, they kind of talked about climate change and environmental degradation in similar terms because, well, climate change is a type of environmental degradation, so it was really hard to sort of spread the two apart. So for this in particular, I'm just going to talk about perceptions of the environment and environmental degradation, whereas climate change fits into this. So since they both, or all participants agreed that the environment is damaged and that there's a desire to connect the two, there was actually different perceptions in the cause of environmental degradation. So here some of them are greed, sin, or personal gain. And a common theme of these are that they're sort of internalized attitudes that people have. For instance, 8 out of 14 people used the word greed or selfishness to describe people's actions in negative ways that caused environmental degradation. Typically, people focused on lifestyle changes as important either in the degradation of the earth or in ways that they need to change them in order to benefit the earth and create sustainability. What there was less attention to was societal or cultural factors. So an example of this that you can see is from this female Buddhist. She said, "I think we are very selfish in the way we go about our business, as far as everyone driving cars rather than carpooling. I kind of think we all know what's happening, but we don't want to think too much about it, because that will mean that we will have to downsize our lifestyle." So here you can see that she's talking very specifically of individuals and people's lifestyles, which is important. It's definitely important to talk about those and to be able to change them. But it's also important to address aspects of it, such as cultural implications of having a vehicle. Like, we culturally are set up in an environment where most people have vehicles. We don't really think about carpooling and that kind of thing. And also it's just a societal norm, obviously, or most of the time it's a societal norm to have a vehicle instead of carpool, or have a vehicle just because it's easier, I guess. But for this, it's not just enough to just try to change people's lifestyles. Instead, we need to look at this in a more structural basis, or in a collection of people, like we have meetings here, which is really cool. So for perceptions of the environment, faith traditions also have different kinds of approaches. So I'll just read these two quotes for you. So the first one is, I think people are going to have to take what I would call a Christ-like attitude and say, okay, you know, I'm giving up things that I know I could enjoy, but I'm doing that because I know that it's for the better good. And another one, we look at the Buddhist teachings on just about anything. It's about being connected, content with what you have, not being greedy, reducing that attachment, learning how that attachment arises, how we keep it going. So you can see that it's sort of similar in the sense that both of them are trying to give, in the sense that both of them are not really necessarily having everything that maybe they would want. But for both of these, they're using different languages based on different religions. For the Christian Mennonite, he's saying that we need to take a Christ-like attitude in order to give up these things. Whereas a Buddhist female is saying that we need to reduce the attachment in order to give up these things. So it's just very interesting to see how different belief systems can really look at these in different ways, but they can still be similar in lots of ways. So for roles for religions in protecting the environment, interviewees also saw religions as an important part of the solutions for the climate crisis. And these are broken into 3 different reasons. So one is respect and caring for creation. Religions include ethics and morality, and religions also influence people. So we'll start with the first one. So in respect and caring for creation, all religions seem to have some sort of taking care of the environment. And you can see that sort of through this quote. You know, I just feel like I have so much to learn from these different points of views. All religions have some sort of view of a creator God, whoever, Allah, etc., etc. The creation story, everyone partakes to that pretty much. So the idea here, and there was more quotes, but this is just the one that we included, is that she's saying that she can learn from many different areas and many different points of views in respect and caring for creation. First, she talked about Aboriginal beliefs and how they have such a strong connection of the environment and of caring for it in a way that we usually don't see. So she wanted to be able to actually look at it even more in depth, and how many religions do talk about respect and caring for the environment. So in that sense, they have a role to play. So religions also include ethics and morality. I didn't include a quote here because there's just so many that are really hard to nail down one, so I'll just talk about them. But ethics and morality come into play when discussing climate change and environmental issues. According to several participants, all of us need to need to ask if it is ethical to personally gain from something if it's hurting others or contributing to the destruction of the planet. So religions are a specified place to talk about ethics and morality, where it can be deliberate and it can also be accepted. Ethics and morality of climate change aren't something that's discussed in all areas. So this is an aspect that religions can really play a role in, because this is a specified area where we can actually talk about ethics and morality. So it's a great area for them to kind of come in and talk about climate change in an ethical and moral sense. So religions also tend to influence people in a few different ways. So one of the ways being that because many people are affiliated with different religions, one of the participants, not the one on the slide, but one of the participants said, if religious leaders pushed for change, it would happen. And that was because there's so many people that are part of religious groups that if their religions really took it on, then that they would have tons of people to be able to back them up. And they could really make a difference in climate change and in having a role in it. For the second one, interviewees also talked about how people of faiths are associated with religious communities and organizations. And you can see that in this quote here. People of faith are at the forefront of many social actions and social justice issues. The fact that we have food banks and the abolition of slavery and on and on and on, these have been spearheaded by people of a religious faith and often in a religious organization. So religion is a very powerful force, and people of faith can have something to say, absolutely. So just the idea that religions really have the ability to influence others.
As you can see from a lot of the quotes that have gone through, people felt that they could learn from each other, and so interfaith dialogue was very beneficial. Not only did it help them to learn from each other, taking on different kind of concepts based on another faith's way of addressing a topic or an issue, but also it can help people rethink their own faith tradition. What does that mean? New ideas come from all kinds of places, but especially from dialogue. And yet another quote associated with that is this one here. I think pretty much within all the major religions would be certainly a broader affirmation of social justice. There's a respect for creation expressed in different ways, and this Catholic man went on and on and on about different ways that respect for creation and social justice were expressed in different faith traditions, and that became beneficial to him. So we have a number of recommendations based on this. Right? First of all, very important to address the issue of climate change at the grassroots level. By that I mean at the congregation, at the mosque, at the synagogue, at the gurdwara. That we can't just leave it to political leaders, but we have to pay attention to it everywhere and say, what can we do as a people, and then how can we, in our group, be a collective actor? How can we advocate to the political leaders, to the city of Edmonton, to the transportation department, to ourselves? What can we do differently? Bringing it down to the grassroots. Also, draw on the resources of one's own tradition. Speak the language, use the concepts, the ways of thinking that we're familiar with. Rediscover those resources that are available to us in each of our particular traditions. And develop preaching tools, teaching tools, and any other tools out of that tradition that can help us think through how can we live our lives differently and have less of an impact, produce less emissions, and so forth. Include science and faith together. As we saw, it wasn't a perception of conflict. And we did have a pretty broad range, not every faith tradition, but a pretty broad range. And there wasn't a sense of religion, science, and conflict. So use it. One of the things was that climate change was spoken of a little bit differently than general environmental degradation. Climate change was spoken of very much through a science lens, without bringing very much of the religious dimension into it. And I think that that's because our religious communities have only recently begun to think of climate change specifically, whereas they have been thinking a little bit longer about things like stewardship of the earth. Fourth, green our sacred spaces. And there's an organization with that as their name. Like it has all kinds of resources and tools for helping us become more energy efficient buildings and congregations, things like that. So a very deliberate and very practical step that we can do. And last of all, our recommendation outside the faith community world, religions are one of the major organizational sectors in civil society. It's one of the ways that people gather together. And even if only 25% of Canadians are attending worship services on a monthly basis, that's still a quarter of Canadians. That's still a lot of people. That's more people than are playing minor hockey or soccer or anything else. So governments should not, and environmental groups should not, and other groups should not ignore faith communities, because we're a place where we're gathering together, we're deliberately talking about the morality of our lives and how to live our lives well and better. And so we are a resource that can help to create change and hopefully help to protect and enhance the environment. So we are open right now for any questions that you have, or better yet, comments. You know, what are some of the things that you're doing in your synagogue or your temple? Well, what are some of the things that you think really need to happen? How concerned are you about climate change? Or are you thinking that all of this is overblown? Now, we're open to questions or comments. Anybody have any thoughts? Okay. You'll have to speak really loudly, okay?
We'll pass the mic. We'll pass the mic.
Is this one? Will this one move? Okay.
In one of your documents, you listed the churches that participated, and you said there were 8 Christian groups, which you only identified 4. Who were the ones that were not?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to list everything, because that was we didn't list the separate kinds of Muslims or the
No,
different
but
kinds of
you
groups
said
either.
8 Christian denominations.
I said 8 Christian people.
Oh, it was people, not denominations.
Right. So there were 2 Pentecostals, 1 Mennonite, 2 Catholics. I don't remember that breakdown actually. Yeah. And again, we were trying to be representative of everybody, and I hope that nobody would ever get the impression that one Muslim man in Edmonton should speak for all Muslim men in Edmonton. That would just be silliness, right? But what we were trying to do is try to dig in deeply and get at the nuances of how these different kinds of things interrelate. I also want to say this that I haven't mentioned yet, is that some resources over there. I brought some of my, I'm a professor. I brought books. But there's a book called Green Deen, What Islam Says About Protecting the Environment. There's a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, on peace and ecology. There's the Pope's encyclical, and there's some other resources. Because faith traditions are increasingly paying attention. But what I'll say as a social scientist is that the theologians are writing, and the faith leaders are making statements. And it hasn't, A, gotten down to the grassroots well yet, and secondly, the social scientists haven't collected as much information and data about what's actually happening rather than what people are writing about should happen.
I'd like to know 2 questions.
Oh, there you are.
One is that how would you suggest that the faith leaders, preachers, imams, clergies should be educated in carrying the message to their organizations? And it will require a lot of work. Second question is that in case a group of people, students or any group of people want to start, what strategy would you suggest how to start? Thank you.
So to address your first question, a bit of it anyway, Randy could probably jump in. But your question was around how would you educate different religious leaders, in a sense?
Carry the message.
Okay.
their conversation?
I think that one area that could be talked about, and there could be many others, but one would be to kind of talk about how science and religion don't have to be in conflict and they can work together. And as Randy was saying, that is something that, as you can see through the participants, like none of them believed that they were in conflict. So to be able to actually use that as a resource could be really helpful. So for them to know that aspects like that don't need to be suppressed and that you can actually talk about things like climate change without needing to just look at the science or just look at it in that lens, I think could be really important.
Let me ask this question. I don't know every faith tradition, so I don't know if you're like Christians, we always get these sermons. How many of you have heard a message about protecting the environment in your faith community? Raise your hand if you have, like from the pulpit. Look, it's not very many people. So right there, there's tons of room for improvement. A study came out of the United States exactly a year ago, and it compared different, mostly kinds of Christians, and how much they were aware of or interested or concerned about climate change. But they also broke it down, not just by Christian denomination, but also some other factors. And one of the things that came out is that white American Catholics hardly ever heard about climate change in their churches. But Hispanic American Catholics heard about it a lot. And their level of awareness and concern was correspondingly higher. Okay, that's a survey. We don't know why there's differences other than that. But we can begin to speculate. And the point is, we need to make this a normal topic of conversation and practice. We need to start hearing about it, talking about it. And we don't really do that in polite society.
Well, I just wish to point out that the scientific community itself is not totally in agreement about the causes of climate change. So for people like us who are not scientists, we are neither deny the climate change, nor we do. We are just confused because this is where perhaps religion comes, that we have to take it in faith. Whereas the environmental degradation is our direct experience. But climate change, honestly, I myself is confused. And in my religion, of course, we always talk about environmental degradation because in India, the holy river Ganges has been totally polluted and so many trees have been cut off. And there are some religious belief that is why only the groves, which is dedicated to the goddess, that is where you will see the original tree. No more the trees who used to live for thousands and 100 years are everywhere. The mountains have been denuded. So environmental degradation is very much our direct experience. But climate change, honestly, I am very confused. Whom to believe?
So the idea that the climate science is, or that the scientists are in disagreement, is actually an illusion. A number of studies have come out that show 97 or 98% scientific consensus. That's way high. That's way higher than even what causes ulcers and things like that. And the point is that there has been a very active disinformation campaign. And I'm a sociologist, and my colleagues, Bob Rule, Riley Dunlap, and some others have been doing the research on that and showing how oil and gas interests primarily have really funded climate denialism, even while they've been doing their own research on how the climate is changing, because it's important for them to be paying attention to what the future effects on their business model might be. So there's been a very, very active disinformation campaign in what I consider just an abhorrent abuse of financial power and access to media.
It seems to me that one of the major differences is not so much about the fact that we believe or we understand that there is an earth problem that needs to be resolved, or we argue is which one of the ways should we go about it, and which one of the ways will have the greatest effect on certain classes of people but not on others. So then which ones do we choose? And that seems to be the major problem facing the 150 nations meeting in France right now.
So for those who may not have been able to hear, he said, most of the time we're not really arguing about if there's a problem, but on how to deal with the problem and which solutions might be better or have different sorts of impacts on different sorts of people. Okay? There was somebody in the back there.
For the grassroots initiatives, I haven't had a chance to Google it yet, so I'll ask you. In my head, I could gather a bunch of my friends and family, kind of like an Avon party, and have someone host and explain ways that we can green our lives, our homes. Do you know if there are people that help, like, it's not necessarily something that's a business, but are there people that do that, will come and talk to church communities or come to your home and tell a group of friends how to greenify your life?
Yeah, if you contact most any environmental organization or even the city of Edmonton, they do have people who will put on workshops and things like that. You know, having a green Tupperware party kind of thing. That's a neat idea that one of the local environmental organizations tried for a couple of years. And I have no idea where that program is at right now. But yeah, that's a great idea. And the point is that we need to work together. I mean, try to lift something with one finger, or one finger on each hand, or a couple fingers together. You know, your whole hand is stronger than all the fingers individually, right? Or take a log out of the fire and hope that it keeps burning. No, it's going to stay burning if it's in the fire with everybody else. And so we stay motivated, and we also encourage each other if we work together. And then there's also a synergistic effect. You know, 2 + 2 = 5 if we're working together. Thanks everybody for being attentive to this. And if you do want somebody to come to your church or your temple or things like that, I'm totally willing to do it. I think Ashley's willing to do it. And she's loving the experience of being challenged to do these sorts of things, right? So let's give her a hand.